And now let's talk about the UK. London is throwing a fit today. They're upset with the EU. And the bone of contention is a string of islands some 13,000 kilometers away, the Falkland Islands. The UK once went to war over them. And now Europe is stoking that old fire. The EU held a meeting with Latin American and Caribbean nations. At this meeting, Argentina brought up its old claim over the Falklands. Europe acknowledged that claim, and then they did something unthinkable. They referred to the Falkland Islands by their Spanish name. Argentina cheered. Britain was furious. Our next report tells you more.
These are the Falkland Islands. In Spanish, they're known as Islas Malvinas. But don't let the British hear you say that name out loud, or they're likely to throw a tantrum, as they're presently doing with the EU. You see, the EU officials met leaders from the CELAC countries. That's a group of 33 nations from Latin America and the Caribbean. Argentina is a member of the CELAC group, and they have an old bone to pick with the UK. Look at the map of the Falklands again. The UK is about 13,000 kilometers away. Argentina is less than 2,000. You would think that the islands are part of Argentina's territory and not the UK's. But you'd be forgetting about Britain's old national hobby, colonization. Here's a quick primer on the Falkland dispute. The British imposed their rule on the islands back in 1833, having taken them from a newly formed independent Argentina, and the islands have been disputed since. The dispute came to a head in 1982. That's when Argentina's military junta, led by Leopoldo Galtieri, tried to seize the Falklands by force. They thought Britain wouldn't do anything about some almost barren islands half the world away. But they underestimated the resolve of Britain's Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. She sent troops to bring the islands back under British control. It led to the brief but brutal Falklands War, where 649 Argentine and 255 British soldiers lost their lives. It ended with the islands still in British control. The war also led to the fall of Galtieri a few days after its conclusion. This is important, because that's the last time Argentina tried to take the islands by force. That doesn't mean Buenos Aires has given up its claim. But now, Argentina's constitution calls for a return of the islands through peaceful means only. Which brings us back to the present. Argentine representatives at the EU summit spoke about their claims on the Falklands, and the EU acknowledged their claim, as they've always done. The dispute has never been settled after all, so that's nothing new. That didn't really bother the British. It was the statement released after the summit which ruffled feathers. This is what it said. Regarding the question of sovereignty over the Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands, the European Union took note of CELAC's historical position based on the importance of dialogue and respect for international law in the peaceful solution of disputes. Now, while it sounds neutral, notice what the islands were called. Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands. Argentine politicians were quick to hype this up. President Alberto Fernandez put out this tweet. He said Argentina's claims to sovereignty through peaceful means and through dialogue remains intact. The country's foreign minister tweeted this. He called it a triumph of Argentine diplomacy. It sounds like a lot of chest thumping over nothing. It's not as though the EU will force Britain to hand over the islands to Argentina. But nonetheless, the British are behaving as though that's the case. After the statement was issued, British diplomats asked European Council President Charles Michel to clarify the EU's position. A host of British politicians are fuming and calling the EU petty and accusing them of stoking tensions. Even the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak entered the fray. He accused the EU of a regrettable choice of words, and he later said that the EU backed down by clarifying that their position on the islands hadn't changed. For a moment, let's ignore the irony here, that the descendant of a former colonial subject is defending a British colony. And let's look at what the EU has said. Initially, some were making fun of the British. An official said, and I quote, "The UK is not part of the EU. They are upset by the use of the word Malvinas. If they were in the EU, perhaps they would have pushed back against it." Clearly a jibe over Brexit. The other EU statements basically stated that the status quo hasn't changed and that the bloc did not take a position on the issue. Basically, the EU washed their hands off the controversy. It hardly sounds like the EU backing down or turning tail. But that may be how Sunak will want to sell this. His party's popularity is terrible, and they need any win they can get, or manufacture. And as for the British position on the islands, they say that in 2013, 99.8% of Falkland residents voted to stay as part of the UK, which is fair. But populating a disputed territory with your own citizens and then claiming the popular mandate hardly seems correct. Sometimes geography makes more sense than a referendum.
For our next story, let me show you a photo. It shows people donning masks of Prime Minister Modi. Do you know who these people are? They're not in a political rally in India. These are people of the Maldives, and they are protesting. What you see is a political protest in the Maldives against India. They call it the India Out campaign. You may have heard about it. It's not a new campaign, but now it's being revived. That's because the Maldives is heading for a presidential election. And a former president is trying to win back power. His name is Abdullah Yameen, a tainted leader currently in jail over corruption charges, backed by China and hoping to be president again. What is his strategy? Targeting India. That's how he plans to win the election. And these protesters that you just saw are Yameen's supporters. They launched their India Out campaign on Eid this month. The election is in the month of September, and like any other country, the Maldives has its own set of problems. Its people have their own challenges, their own priorities. But Yameen is determined to make this about India. He wants the election agenda to be dominated by India. Remember, this man was ousted from power in 2018, and since then, his politics has been focused on India. He's been the face of the India Out campaign. He's been pushing it for years now. It comes like a flash in the pan. But it's been hard to sustain. It hasn't gained much traction, mostly because of Yameen's own tainted reputation. He's serving an 11-year jail sentence for taking bribes and laundering money. He did this while he was president. And that's not all. As president, Yameen was called China's man in Mali. There was an open door for Chinese investments in the country. Yameen cleared a series of Chinese projects. And in the process, he pushed his country into a debt trap. During the Yameen years, Mali raked up over $1 billion in Chinese debt. That's a lot of money for this country. More than $1 billion. The voters saw through Yameen. In 2018, he was voted out of power, and Ibrahim Mohammed Soli took over as president. Under Soli, Mali's relationship with New Delhi has strengthened, and China's influence has diminished. India has gained a stronger foothold. In the last 4 years, New Delhi has signed a wide range of pacts, from defense to infrastructure. It has also given Mali $2.7 billion. This is in the form of loans. Also, development assistance for infrastructure projects. But unlike China, India's assistance does not compromise the sovereignty of the Maldives. And they acknowledge that. The government of the Maldives has slammed Yameen and the India Out campaign. In fact, let me quote from a statement by the Maldivian government. This is about the recent protests. This is what they say. Such dishonorable acts by the opposition regarding one of Maldives' key bilateral partners and its leadership during Eid al-Adha festivities, a time of peace, joy and harmony, does not only provoke hatred but also promote hostility, with the objective of tarnishing the country's long-standing cordial ties with India. So Mali is not wavering from its position, but ahead of the election, President Soli faces a challenge. There is a split in the ruling coalition. Mohammad Nasheed, the former president, has quit the ruling party. He stepped down last month, apparently a power struggle. Soli and Nasheed were not getting along. They were at odds on multiple issues. Ultimately, Nasheed walked out. And now he's floated his own party. It's called the Democrats. Reports say Nasheed could also join hands with Yameen. No formal confirmation yet, but this month there was a meeting in Mali. Nasheed's team met with members of Yameen's party. And they're said to have discussed ways to, quote-unquote, find common ground before the presidential election. So will they formally join hands? We'll have to wait and see. But if it happens, it would be a dramatic turn of events. You see, there's a history between Yameen and Nasheed. They were fierce political rivals. In 2015, when Yameen was president, Nasheed was arrested on charges of terrorism. He was forced into exile for 2 years. He returned when Soli won the election in 2018. So an alliance between Yameen and Nasheed is a highly unlikely one. At the same time, it cannot be ruled out. It's hard to say how this will impact Soli's chances. As of today, there is no clear front-runner in the upcoming election. Recently, a think tank in the Maldives conducted an opinion poll. This is what they found. 52% of the voters are on the fence, undecided. 15% back Soli, 10% want to vote for Yamin, and only 6% back Mohammad Nasheed. The election is still 2 months away, and that's a very long time in politics. UK-EU is not the only diplomatic showdown. There is another one unfolding, this one more serious and more violent. It's between Sweden and Iraq. Today, hundreds of protesters turned up outside the Swedish embassy in Baghdad. Take a look at the pictures. They stormed the building, set fires inside and shouted slogans well into the day. Thankfully, no one was hurt. Sweden says all its diplomatic staff are safe. But what triggered this outrage? A controversial decision by the Swedish police. They have given permission for another problematic protest, this time outside Iraq's embassy in Stockholm. Reports say it's not just any protest, they're planning to burn and desecrate the Quran. A similar protest was organized last month as well. One man burnt pages from the Quran in front of a mosque. Sweden allowed that protest to happen. They said this was freedom of speech. You may remember the backlash that followed. Every Muslim nation lined up to condemn Sweden, but clearly no lessons learned. So that explains the why of today's protest in Iraq. But it doesn't answer the how. How did hundreds of people just spontaneously decide to gather at the embassy, and that too just hours after Sweden's decision? Because this was not just public outrage. There was an element of planning. Today's protest was called by this man, Muqtada al-Sadr, a powerful Shia cleric in Iraq. His party has the most number of seats in Iraq's parliament. So why isn't he in power? Because Iran does not like him. Parties backed by Tehran hold considerable influence in Baghdad. Al-Sadr did not get their support. So he's not in power, but he's out on the streets and still formidable. Take a look at these pictures now. They are from July last year. Muqtada al-Sadr supporters stormed Iraq's parliament. They staged a sit-in and refused to leave. The next month, in August, there was a repeat. And this time, the presidential palace was targeted. My point is, Muqtada al-Sadr specializes in these sort of protests. Gather a lot of people, storm important buildings, and send a strong message. But will Iraq's government listen? Well, they have condemned the attack on Sweden's embassy. At the same time, they had a warning for Stockholm. If another Quran is burnt, we will cut all diplomatic ties. For good measure, they also expelled Sweden's ambassador to Iraq. So Baghdad means business. And how is Sweden responding? Well, they summoned Iraq's ambassador this morning. They also accused Iraq of failing to protect their diplomats. But what about the Quran burning? No word on that. In many ways, these are two extremes of politics. One ignores and insults religion. And for what? Wrong ideas of freedom of speech. The other milks religion for political gains. I would say both are problematic. Just look at Sweden's reaction to the last incident. This is what they said. The burning of the Quran or any other holy text is an offensive and disrespectful act. Expressions of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance have no place in Sweden or in Europe. It sounds perfect, right? But weeks later, another Quran is set to be burnt in the same country. Makes you wonder what is going on. You're admitting that something is wrong and xenophobic, yet you're doing nothing to stop it. Free speech cannot be limitless and racist, because then it's a slippery slope. What if Iraq turns around and says, storming embassies is freedom of expression? Would Sweden accept that? They shouldn't, because it's not. At the same time, burning a holy book is not acceptable. As for Iraq, their problem is the opposite, too much religion. Muqtada al-Sadr is a cleric. He thrives on using religion in politics. Some say he wants to do in Iraq what Ayatollah Khomeini did in Iran. Never stopped him from violence, though. Al-Sadr's men have been accused of killing Iraqi Sunnis. They've been accused of massacre. His own fellow Muslims. So I guess it's all about politics of convenience. Muslim nations lined up to criticize Sweden last month, but how many of them talk about China's Uyghurs? None. This trend of using religion in politics is a dangerous one. Simply ignoring it is not an option, because then you turn into a Sweden. No red lines, no respect. But Muqtada al-Sadr and his protesters are not the answer to that. You need common sense policies that respect all communities, both their rights and their sentiments. This week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan set off on a whirlwind tour. He had 3 stops: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. Basically a Gulf tour. But what explains Erdogan's sudden wanderlust? The answer is investments. You see, the Turkish economy is crumbling. Their currency, the lira, is plummeting. Inflation, on the other hand, is soaring. In the month of June, Turkey's official inflation rate was 38%, but estimates say the actual rate was around 108%. So Erdogan clearly needs these investments, and he needs them fast, which is why he turned to his rich Gulf neighbors. You could say his tour was a glorified funding ground. And did it work? Well, he told you about the first leg yesterday. His first stop was Saudi Arabia. He met Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The two behaved like long-lost friends. Clearly, the memory of Erdogan once calling MBS a murderer is not haunting relations anymore. Instead, it was all hugs and drone deals. Turkish firm Bekar signed a drone deal with Saudi Arabia. It's apparently a big one. This is Turkey's biggest ever aviation export contract. So clearly, Riyadh is buying a lot of drones. We don't know the number yet, but it sounds like a success for Erdogan. It also helps that the drone-making company is run by his son-in-law, so a double win. Next, the Turkish president traveled to Qatar. They talked about boosting bilateral ties and put up a strong show of friendship. And finally, Erdogan landed in the UAE, the last stop of his 3-leg tour. Here he met UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. They signed deals worth $50 billion. So all in all, the trip sounds like a success. Erdogan got the defense deals. He got the investments. He also got the morale boost. It's quite a story, really, and a lesson on how leaders who lose track of reality have to eat humble pie. Not very long ago, Erdogan's equation with some of these Gulf leaders was bitter. He almost called the Saudi leader a murderer. And he had a working relationship with the Qatari leader, more like a marriage of convenience. In 2017, when Qatar was blockaded by other Gulf nations, Erdogan stood by them. Turkey sent food, water, and medicines to Qatar, even stationed troops there. And in return, Qatar helped Turkey on the international stage. It sided with Ankara in the Arab League, and investments kept flowing. So the bonhomie with Qatar now is not too strange. But with Saudi Arabia, it's quite a U-turn. Just 3 years ago, Erdogan and MBS were at loggerheads. It started with the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It happened in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. Erdogan blamed MBS for the murder. The countries boycotted each other's imports, they banned each other's media, and the rivalry of the leaders was for the world to see. Because both these men, MBS and Erdogan, have lofty ambitions. They see themselves as the leader of the Islamic world. But MBS has a little edge here. He is, after all, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, the custodian of Islam's holiest sites, plus he has the petrodollars. You can't be the king of the Islamic world without money. But Erdogan challenged that, and he lost. The last few years have been tough for his country. The president's dreams of a new Ottoman Empire have been punctured. Erdogan has toned down the rhetoric since. He's now trying to fix the economy that he broke, and for that, he's reaching out to the Gulf nations. He needs their friendship and their money. So he pulled off a charm offensive. The Turkish president gifted all 3 leaders electric vehicles. This model, called the TOG, a Turkish-made electric car. MBS even drove Erdogan around in it. But it's a bit early to say who is taking whom for a ride. And now let's shift our focus to Afghanistan, where women took to the streets to protest against the Taliban. This is against another attack on their freedom. Earlier this month, the Taliban banned beauty salons, one of the last means of employment available to Afghan women. They've already barred from most forms of employment and education, and now the Taliban have decided to shut this refuge as well. But some brave Afghan women took to the streets of Kabul, demanding that they be allowed to feed their families. Of course, the Taliban are not ones to tolerate defiance. Here's what followed.
Since the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021, there's been a continuous assault on the freedom of women. First, they were barred from attending schools, then colleges. Slowly, they were restricted from public spaces, like gyms, parks, and even fairs. They've also been stopped from working. The women politicians went first. Then, the Taliban began banning other jobs. At the beginning of this month, they banned another form of employment, beauty salons. Salons served multiple purposes for Afghan women. They offered a way to support families, with salon workers sometimes being the only working member in a household. The salons also brought some financial independence to Afghan women. And they were also one of the last remaining places they could be without men present. A place for women to gather and network away from the Taliban's prying eyes. Now, even that sanctuary is falling. The Taliban said all salons have to wind up by the end of this month. All the years of hard work put in by Afghan women is to be shuttered in a few days. And this fresh inflicted misery is what brought Afghan women out to the streets of Kabul yesterday. Some 50 salon workers gathered to protest. Work, food, and freedom. It sounds so basic, but it's a dream for Afghan women. A dream they're often violently woken up from. When the Taliban got word of the gathering, their enforcers descended upon the protesters. They fired guns into the air to scare off the women. Then they used fire hoses as makeshift water cannons. And they also used tasers. Imagine using tasers on dozens of women who just want to continue working, continue feeding their families.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan must realize that there are many Afghan women who have no food. They are poor and have no one to take care of them. They themselves must work, and some of them having beauty salons, which is their only source of income. In my opinion, these salons should not be closed.
But the Taliban have no consideration for that. Their leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, ordered salons shut, and the Taliban's Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice issued the decree. The reasons are the usual. The Taliban thinks salons are un-Islamic. They said too much makeup prevented women from praying properly, and that some services offered by salons were prohibited by religion. Another explanation for the ban was that too much money spent on makeovers caused hardships for poor families, especially for the families of grooms during wedding functions, apparently. It is as ridiculous as it sounds, possibly to make weddings cheaper for Taliban fighters. It's not like the warlords in Kabul have been making lives economically better for Afghans. So it seems they're banning even mildly expensive things to make the situation look better. The women protesters wanted to have a discussion with the Taliban, maybe find some middle ground, but they were dispersed.
They dispersed our gathering. We, the women who remained here, are going to the United Nations and defend. Women, don't get separated, stay together.
But will the UN listen? Is anyone willing to do something about the plight of Afghan women? Or, much like their salons, will their hopes and futures be shut as well indefinitely?
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Peru. The South American country is on the boil. Anti-government protests have erupted once again. People are demanding President Dina Boluarte's resignation. She's been accused of illegally ousting her predecessor, Pedro Castillo. In the US, a tornado left a trail of destruction in North Carolina. It also caused significant damage at a Pfizer facility. And a group of divers rescued whale sharks from fishing nets in Indonesian waters. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1969, American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin walked on the moon. They became the first two human beings to do so. Millions of people around the world were glued to their television sets to witness this historic moment. This was when Armstrong famously said, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
I believe they're setting up the flag now.
Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent?
Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars.
Do what? Look at this.